3 minutes ago, I signed the order. Every French soldier in Burkina Faso is leaving. Not tomorrow. Not next month. Today. They told me it would be political suicide to expel the French army. My generals warned me. Paris threatened me. Washington whispered that Africa couldn't survive without French protection. Even some of my own advisors pulled me aside and said, "Mr. President, you're playing with fire. No African leader survives a war with France." And Macron? He's shocked. His defense minister is scrambling. NATO headquarters is holding an emergency session. The Elysee Palace is frantically calling Washington, demanding to know how this young man dared to challenge an empire that has dominated Africa for over a century. I answered them all with one document. Executive Order 2024-1, the complete termination of French military presence in Burkina Faso. Effective immediately. My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is the story of how I declared independence from France's colonial army. Not just for Burkina Faso, but for an entire continent that's waited 64 years to finally be free. Why does this moment change everything? Because for the first time since 1960, an African nation has told France, "We don't need your soldiers. We don't want your protection. And we will no longer accept your control." Let me start with something they never teach in French schools. For 64 years, French troops have been stationed across Africa, not to protect us, but to protect French interests. They called it cooperation. We knew it for what it was. Occupation with better uniforms. From Senegal to Chad, from Ivory Coast to the Central African Republic, French military bases were scattered across the continent like colonial checkpoints. Over 5,000 soldiers spread across 8 countries, all with one mission: to make sure Africa never became truly independent. They told us those troops were here to fight terrorism, to maintain stability, to provide security. But I grew up seeing the truth behind the lies. I saw French convoys escorting trucks filled with our uranium to ports we weren't even allowed to use. I saw villages living in darkness while French companies powered Europe with our resources. I saw my people starving while French corporations exported our food to Paris supermarkets. This wasn't security. It was extraction backed by military force. The system was simple, but ruthless. Keep African armies weak and dependent. Station French troops as the real security force. Use that presence to guarantee French economic control. Any African leader who resisted this arrangement faced 2 options: obey or be removed. They called it the France-Afrique system. We called it neo-colonialism with automatic weapons. But here's what they didn't understand about my generation of African leaders. We didn't grow up thankful for French protection. We grew up furious about French control. 3 weeks ago, my intelligence chief handed me a classified report that made my blood boil. French troops weren't just in Burkina Faso. They were actively working with multinational corporations to secure mining concessions and extraction deals. Our own military intelligence documented French soldiers guarding foreign companies, while Burkinabe villages faced terrorist attacks with no protection. France's priority wasn't our safety. It was corporate profit. The report included satellite images of French bases. Every major base was near mineral deposits, not population centers. Intercepted communications revealed French commanders talking about economic security zones and resource protection protocols. But the document that broke me was a memo from the French embassy to Paris. It said, "African leadership remains compliant. Military dependence ensures continued access to strategic resources. Recommend maintaining current troop levels to prevent sovereignty complications." Sovereignty complications. That's what they called African independence. That night, I stayed in my office until dawn. Outside, Ouagadougou slept peacefully, unaware that their president was about to make the most dangerous decision in the nation's history. I asked myself the question every African leader eventually faces. Do I want to be remembered as a caretaker of French interests, or as the man who finally gave Africa back her dignity? The answer came with the sunrise. At 5 a.m., I called my senior commanders. Gentlemen, I said, today we reclaim our sovereignty. Prepare the orders for the full withdrawal of French forces. No negotiations, no delays, no exceptions. General Kabor, my closest advisor, asked the question I knew was coming. Mr. President, are you sure? France has toppled governments for less. General, I said, France has controlled governments for more. Today, that is. At 11:47 a.m., I walked into the presidential conference room where the order was waiting. One page. 47 words. The most important sentence in Burkina Faso's modern history. By executive authority of the Republic of Burkina Faso, all French military personnel are hereby ordered to cease operations and depart national territory within 72 hours. No exceptions will be granted. My hand didn't shake as I signed. This wasn't fear. This was freedom. The moment my pen lifted, history shifted. The last African country still hosting French troops by choice had just chosen differently. Within minutes, the French embassy received the news. Within an hour, Paris knew. Within 2 hours, the world was watching an African president do something no one thought possible: fire France. The response from Paris was swift and predictable. Ambassador Laurent Decoux demanded an emergency meeting to clarify this misunderstanding. I refused. There was nothing to clarify and nothing to misunderstand. France's defense minister, Sébastien Lecornu, called me personally. His voice was sharp with anger. President Traoré, he said, this decision threatens regional stability and Franco-African cooperation. Minister, I replied, stability doesn't require occupation. And cooperation isn't real cooperation if only one side benefits. The call lasted 6 minutes. France wasn't used to African leaders hanging up on them. But the real storm erupted inside the Élysée Palace. Leaked transcripts from Macron's emergency cabinet meeting described the French president slamming the table, shouting, "How did we lose Burkina Faso in one morning? This boy is destroying decades of strategic positioning." His foreign policy team scrambled. Emergency calls to Washington, Brussels, and African capitals. Diplomatic pressure through international organizations. Threats disguised as concerns about security. French media went into overdrive. Headlines screamed about African ingratitude and dangerous populism. Opinion pieces warned of chaos without French protection. The same newspapers that had ignored decades of French exploitation suddenly claimed to care deeply about African welfare. But something had shifted across our continent. Young Africans no longer rely on French newspapers for their news. They saw through the propaganda instantly. While Paris panicked, African streets erupted in celebration. From Bamako to Niamey, from Dar to N'Djamena, crowds gathered, chanting my name and singing songs of independence. In Mali, President Assimi Goïta called me within hours. "Ibrahim," he said, "you've done what we've all wanted to do." Mali stands with Burkina Faso. Niger's leadership contacted us through secure channels. The French told us you'd collapse without their protection. Instead, you look stronger than ever. By evening, demonstrations spread across West Africa. University students organized rallies demanding their governments follow Burkina Faso's example. Market women refused to buy French products. Youth organizations insisted on African solutions to African problems. The hashtag #FranceSoutofAfrica trended in 12 countries. Social media overflowed with videos of young Africans celebrating. The viral moment wasn't the signing ceremony. It was a clip of children in rural Burkina Faso cheering, "No more French soldiers. Africa for Africans." Even in France's remaining allies, cracks appeared. Senegal's opposition leaders demanded a referendum on French troop presence. Chadian civil society called for the same. The dominoes were starting to fall. When military pressure failed, France turned to economic weapons. Within 48 hours, our access to French development funds was suspended for review. The World Bank raised concerns about political instability. The IMF warned that our decision reflected concerning trends. French companies began pulling out of infrastructure projects. Diplomatic leaks painted Burkina Faso as increasingly isolated, but I had prepared for this moment. For months, my economic team had been diversifying our partnerships. Within a week, new opportunities opened. China offered immediate infrastructure investment with no political strings. Russia proposed security cooperation based on respect, not dependency. Turkey, India, and Brazil reached out with equal partnerships. The African Development Bank increased funding for our projects. Fellow African nations opened trade corridors that bypassed French-controlled ports. Gulf states offered investment packages far greater than anything France had ever given. The message was clear. Africa didn't need French money. We needed African dignity. This terrified Western capitals. If Burkina Faso could expel French troops, others might follow. If France lost its military foothold, its entire France-Afrique system could collapse. American officials quietly worried about Russia and China's influence. British diplomats warned of dangerous precedents. German leaders urged measured responses. But the most powerful reaction came from Africans themselves. For the first time in decades, African ambassadors at the UN weren't apologizing for challenging the West. They were celebrating a country finally acting sovereign. The African Union, usually cautious, issued a statement affirming every state's right to decide its own security. ECOWAS declared solidarity with Burkina Faso's decisions. Even South Africa called it a legitimate expression of sovereignty deserving respect. France grew increasingly isolated, defending a colonial relationship the world now saw as outdated. Their propaganda pushed one message: without France, Burkina Faso would fall to terrorists. They painted apocalyptic scenarios of chaos. Their message was simple: Africans couldn't protect themselves. But this was their biggest lie, and their greatest fear. French troops had not eliminated terrorism. If anything, they worsened it by creating dependency and resentment. Communities saw them guarding foreign mines, while villages were left defenseless. Our own military, long restrained by French protocols, was finally free to build African solutions. Within weeks, we launched community defense programs that Paris had forbidden. Local militias, trained by our own soldiers, proved more effective than any foreign army. They knew the terrain, spoke the languages, and had personal stakes in protecting their villages. Regional cooperation with Mali and Niger, once filtered through French command, became direct and immediate. African armies began working together, sharing intelligence, coordinating operations without European intermediaries. The results were undeniable. Security incidents in areas once protected by French troops actually dropped after their withdrawal. African solutions were working better than colonial impositions. My decision sparked something unprecedented: a continent-wide conversation about real independence. Civil society, youth movements, and political leaders began questioning their own ties to former colonial powers. In Chad, students demanded French troops leave. In Senegal, opposition parties called for a referendum. Even in Ivory Coast, France's closest ally, voices began questioning foreign dependency. The conversation spread beyond Francophone Africa. Nigeria questioned British economic influence. Kenya debated ending military cooperation with the West. Ghana's president openly promoted African-led security. For the first time since independence, African nations weren't just dreaming of unity, they were treating it as a necessity for true sovereignty. The African Continental Free Trade Area, once blocked by European interference, finally gained new momentum. African leaders understood that true economic integration could only come with real political independence. Talk of currency unions, free from European control, moved from theory to serious policy. France's biggest fear was coming true. Africa was realizing it could succeed without European permission. When I expelled French troops, the impact spread far beyond Africa. In the Caribbean, former French colonies began rethinking their ties with Paris. In the Pacific, island nations started questioning their defense deals with France. Even territories like New Caledonia and French Polynesia were watching closely. The message was clear: small nations could stand up to great powers and survive. Latin American countries, long pressured by U.S. military influence, took notice. Southeast Asian nations, caught between Chinese expansion and Western interference, saw a new model of sovereignty. Across the global South, Africa's example was spreading. China and Russia, eager to fill the gap left by France, offered partnerships built on mutual benefit instead of dependency. Their success in Burkina Faso was shaping how they approached the developing world. The United States, worried about losing influence, quietly began reviewing its own military footprint in Africa. Even Europe had to face reality: either adapt to a post-colonial Africa or watch African nations turn to new partners who respected their sovereignty. But these decisions came with personal risks. French intelligence had a long history of targeting African leaders who resisted them: Sylvanus Olympio in Togo, Thomas Sankara here in Burkina Faso, Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. The list was long and bloody. I knew the danger. My security was tightened. Travel plans became classified. My family was quietly moved for safety. Every meal was tested, every car inspected, every meeting carefully screened. Decades of French intelligence networks inside Burkina Faso now became potential threats. Our counterintelligence worked day and night to protect our government from sabotage. Travel abroad became more difficult. French allies questioned my safety at summits. European airports treated me with unusual suspicion. But the love of my people made every risk worth it. Villages that had never seen their president before invited me to celebrate independence. Children who once grew up under the shadow of foreign soldiers now played freely where French military zones once stood. The pride in their eyes, the dignity in their voices, the hope in their dreams, this was worth any danger. 6 months after expelling French troops, Burkina Faso stands stronger than ever. Our economy has grown as resources once spent on foreign militaries are now directed to development. Security has improved through community-led solutions and regional cooperation. International partnerships are expanding beyond anything France ever allowed. China is building infrastructure. Turkey is investing in development. India is sharing technology. Brazil is supporting agriculture. But most importantly, our people have rediscovered their dignity. Students now learn African history without foreign filters. Farmers grow for African markets, not French quotas. Miners work for African development, not European consumption. The French predicted chaos. Instead, we found freedom. And other African nations are following. Mali expelled French forces soon after. Niger is reconsidering its military deals. Chad's leaders are under pressure to do the same. The dominoes are falling. France's empire in Africa, built on over a century of exploitation, is collapsing because one African leader finally said, "Enough." The lesson is simple. France needs Africa more than Africa needs France. They need our resources, our markets, our land. We need only our dignity, our sovereignty, our right to decide our future. For too long, we were told Africa couldn't survive without Europe. That was a myth, one that served Europe, not Africa. The truth is the opposite. Europe cannot maintain its lifestyle without African resources. When Africa demands fair partnership, the dynamic changes. When we negotiate from strength, we get better outcomes. When we believe in our own potential, we unlock power we never imagined. The choice for African leaders is clear: remain dependent clients of foreign powers, or become proud citizens of independent nations. Comfort is temporary. Dignity is eternal. This is not about being anti-French or anti-Western. It is about being pro-African. We welcome any nation that respects our sovereignty and treats us as equals. But we reject any relationship based on dependency, exploitation, or the assumption that our consent is optional. France could have chosen cooperation over control, partnership over domination. They chose otherwise, and now they face the consequences. Africa's choice, however, has already been made. We choose independence, sovereignty, and dignity. To other global powers, the message is simple. Africa is open for business, but only as equals. The era of neo-colonial exploitation is ending. What comes next depends on how quickly the world accepts Africa's new reality. To young Africans, this is your moment. The generation that tolerated European control is fading. A new generation demanding African solutions is rising. Our continent has everything: resources, people, talent, potential. The only thing missing was the courage to claim it. That courage is spreading from Burkina Faso across Africa. 3 minutes ago, I signed an order expelling French troops. But today, I signed something far more important: Africa's declaration of independence from the colonial mindset. This revolution is not just military, it is psychological. It is the moment Africans stop asking for permission and start demanding respect. It is when we stop accepting exploitation and start expecting partnership. It is when the continent that built the pyramids, gave the world mathematics and medicine, survived slavery and colonialism, finally stands up and says, "We are not your children. We are your equals." This revolution will not be managed by France. It will not be contained by Western powers. It will be African, by Africans, for Africa. And it has already begun. I am Ibrahim Traoré. This is how we reclaimed independence, not just from French troops, but from the colonial mindset that made them seem necessary. The future belongs to those bold enough to seize it. Africa's future belongs to Africans. France has already learned this lesson the hard way. Others can choose the easy way, through partnership instead of domination. But one way or another, they will learn. The age of colonialism, military, economic, and psychological, is ending. Africa is not for sale. Africa is not for rent. Africa is not for control. Africa is for Africans. And that is non-negotiable.